Now that we've reviewed the use of declared distance information for our departure runway, let's take a closer look at what lies just beyond the runway. In this chapter, we'll review the differences between climb performance, obstacle avoidance, and departure procedures. There are a number of common misunderstandings about departure planning. Over the years, the lack of standardization between training centers and instructors has further complicated this issue. So the second goal of this chapter is to review the fundamentals to help you make the most informed decision possible. There is a lot of questionable advice out there related to departure planning. We've all been told things like you can't accept a SID unless you can fly it with an engine out, or that if your second segment climb gradient is equal to the SID gradient, then you can safely fly the SID with an engine out. Or even, when in doubt, just hold V2 all the way up to MEA. Confusion about these issues is so widespread that in 2012, the NBAA, FAA, and several manufacturers created a working group to help disseminate better information. We'll be digging into that knowledge base and how it relates to Tyson Aviation throughout this course. A lot of the confusion stems from the fact that there are 3 different entities with 3 very different agendas, all providing information related to takeoff. You have the aircraft manufacturer, the aircraft operator, and the FAA. Each group has a different objective and a different set of responsibilities, but they all use a lot of the same numbers and overlapping vocabulary, which can make it difficult to discern one subject from another. The aircraft manufacturer is responsible for demonstrating compliance with Part 25 requirements. In simplest terms, this means proving that their aircraft can adequately get away from the runway after an engine failure. The aircraft operator, on the other hand, is responsible for developing contingency procedures which will avoid obstacles after an engine failure. And finally, the FAA is responsible for publishing normal departure procedures. FAR Part 25 establishes the certification requirements for transport category aircraft. One requirement is guaranteed climb performance with an engine failure at V1. To help analyze this performance and to standardize certification, the takeoff flight path is divided into segments. Different airplanes have to demonstrate different climb gradients during each of these segments. 2 terms used throughout any discussion of departure planning are gross climb gradient and net climb gradient. The gross climb gradient represents the performance demonstrated under certification conditions. The net climb gradient is derived by reducing the gross climb by specific percentages to establish a margin of safety. The more conservative net climb gradient has to clear all the specified obstacles along the departure path by 35 feet and is meant to be used as a departure planning number. For certification purposes, takeoff begins from a standing start with engine stabilized at takeoff thrust before brake release. The engine is failed just prior to V1 and remains inoperative through the rest of the takeoff. First segment begins at liftoff and continues until the gear are fully retracted. The aircraft then accelerates to V2, or in the case of the Falcon 50, maintains V2, and attains an altitude of 35 feet. This point is known as reference 0. Second segment begins when the gear are retracted, and it continues at V2 until reaching the acceleration height, at least 400 feet, with no changes to configuration or thrust. The third, or transition segment, begins at the acceleration height. The aircraft maintains level flight while the flaps and slats are retracted and the engines are reduced to maximum continuous thrust. Third segment ends when the aircraft is clean and climbs to 1,500 feet at its final takeoff speed. Final takeoff speed is now designated by the FAA as VFTO. However, in the Falcon 10, it's described as VFS. In the Falcon 50, it's called 1.5 VS, and the 2000 uses VFT. The final segment refers to the climb at final takeoff speed from 1,500 feet to the en route structure. Here's what the entire one-engine inoperative certification takeoff flight path looks like. Now throughout this, keep in mind that changing your wing configuration has an impact on takeoff climb performance. Using slats and flaps will reduce the runway required, but generally result in a diminished climb. Conversely, a slats-only takeoff will increase the runway required because it takes longer to reach V2, but once airborne, improves second segment performance. Problems begin to arise when pilots try to apply the one engine inoperative takeoff climb data, second segment in particular, to SIDS and ODPs. The most common mistake is trying to oversimplify the planning process by simply comparing the SID climb gradient to the second segment climb gradient with no further analysis. This line of thinking is easy to understand because at a glance, it would seem to make sense that as long as your second segment climb gradient is equal to or greater than what the SID requires, you should clear any obstacles along your departure path. However, the fundamental problem here is that SIDS and ODPs are normal all-engine procedures. Let's take a quick look at the aim. ODPs and SIDS assume normal aircraft performance and that all engines are operating. Development of contingency procedures required to cover the case of an engine failure or other emergency in flight that may occur after liftoff is the responsibility of the operator. For more detailed information on this specific subject, refer to Advisory Circular AC 12091 and Chapter 2 in the Instrument Procedures Handbook. Because SIDS and ODPs were never intended to be flown with an engine out, their construction doesn't take the one-engine inoperative climb path geometry into consideration. Let's take a closer look at the potential impact this has on departure planning. The second segment climb gradient published in the AFM for any given weight is a spot value recorded at the start of second segment. It's intended to document compliance with Part 25. And even though it makes use of the word obstacle, this data is not meant to be extrapolated for departure planning. One big reason for this is that during the transition segment, you're flying essentially straight and level. So even if your second segment climb gradient and the SID requirement agree at the end of the runway, the engine failure profile will diverge rapidly. Another factor to consider is that during second segment, you're flying an indicated airspeed, V2. And this means that your climb gradient will flatten out with altitude due to increasing true airspeed. Also, keep in mind that climb path charts in the AFM are only valid for obstacles that lie within the jurisdiction of the chart. So if the chart stops at 400 feet vertically or at 7,000 feet downrange, then that's the limit of reliable data. Finally, consider that during certification, the engine is failed precisely at V1. The aircraft is rotated smartly at VR, and V2 is attained exactly at 35 feet above the runway. But if an engine fails above V1, your airspeed at 35 feet will be higher than V2. And in this event, Dassault recommends that you keep the higher airspeed rather than pitching up to reacquire V2. In the Falcon 2000, that higher airspeed is limited to V2 plus 10. So we can see that extrapolating second segment gradient as a rise over run projection is problematic because following an engine failure, the aircraft will not climb out along a straight path. One other consideration to keep in mind is that SIDS ignore low close-in obstacles. Trying to account for all the low close-in obstacles would result in excessive climb gradient requirements. Instead, they simply make notes of these obstacles in the takeoff minimum section of the terminal procedures to alert pilots so that these obstacles can be avoided. However, the good news here is that AirInc Direct and APG do account for the low close-in obstacles which SIDS ignore. The bottom line here is that takeoff performance and obstacle avoidance must be considered separately. To help reinforce these concepts, let's take a look at an excerpt from a recent TAP working group session. Rob Root is a flight operations engineer at Boeing Commercial Airplanes, an expert in performance engineering and a member of the TAP working group.
Rob Root from Boeing is going to explain to you what this slide means.
Start with big picture before detail. So climb and obstacle clearance, completely separate. Don't even think about them together. But here's what a pilot might be inclined to do. So my twin engine airplane has to have a second segment gradient of 2.4%. That's 2.4 feet up for every 100 feet forward. So as long as the obstacle doesn't violate that line, I'm always okay, right? Well, that's what's represented by the dashed or the dotted yellow line there. That's assuming the airplane maintains a constant gradient equal to what the gradient is right at the point where the gear comes up. Well, let's talk about reality. Before that point, the airplane is in a considerably worse drag configuration, right? We have the gear down still. In fact, it could get worse before it gets better because we might have an airplane where the gear doors come open to allow the airplane to retract the gear. Where we're evaluating that second segment gradient, the gradient's actually worse. Okay, what about after that? Well, after that, thrust is going to lapse as we climb up in altitude, right? And it's also going to lapse to some degree because we're holding a constant indicated airspeed, V2, and yet our true airspeed is going up as we go up in altitude. So that's going to cause a loss of gradient too. So what we're trying to illustrate here, the blue line, which is what we really think the airplane is going to do, is underneath that dotted yellow line. And that's a bad thing, right? Because we're assuming any obstacle underneath that dotted yellow line is good to go. And yet the blue line is what the airplane actually does. So what's the third problem, and maybe the biggest problem? We hit this level flight, acceleration and cleanup segment, right? So we have another limit we have to be worried about, which is how long can we hold takeoff thrust? And for a lot of engines, that's 5 minutes. So we need to pitch the airplane over, and typically level flight is assumed, and we need to get cleaned up so that we can bring the power back to maximum continuous before we start that final segment. Well, now you can see this is where that blue line, the real airplane flight path, diverges significantly from that best case assumption that we were making, right? And then in the final segment here, we're accounting for the fact that we have gear up, we have flaps up, we're at a different speed, we're at a different thrust, etc. So the big picture, the thing I want you to take away from this, climb and obstacle clearance, two completely separate subjects. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
I know you're trying to represent that you go from takeoff to 400 feet, but is there really an appreciable difference between 0 and 400 feet as far as loss of thrust and also transitioning from gear to the gear out? Yeah, I mean, we're talking percentage-wise. It doesn't seem really significant.
I hate to go back to those spaghetti charts that pilots don't like. But the next time you have one of those spaghetti charts out, you know, the one where all the lines start down in the corner and then they kind of diverge? Take your eye and put it next to the corner and sight along those lines on the chart, and you'll see they're not straight lines. And that, in fact, is exactly what that chart is showing you. It's showing you degradation in climb as you go up. Is it significant? Well, first of all, I can say it's significant enough that it would be illegal to ignore it, right, in terms of dispatch. But secondly, I would say for a close-in limiting obstacle, it could be a consideration. Probably a bigger consideration is that level-off segment. And there's one other thing. The climb performance doesn't account for wind. So if we take off with, let's say, 10 knots of tailwind, well, the climb performance is the same. The obstacle clearance is considerably worse. So there's another variable not accounted for in climb performance, but that must be accounted for obstacle clearance.
My second question is it given that if we leave the flaps at whatever the takeoff setting is, it's presumed to be that that's going to be worst case second segment climb performance. It's better to take off with a minimum flap setting to basically enhance the performance of second segment climb, correct? Now, is there at some time where the distance to the obstacle, where those two meet and cross, and where would that average?
So I can't answer it specifically for any given airplane, but basically the question has to do with flap selection. And if all we're worried about is climb performance, as a general rule, a less deflected flap is going to give us better climb performance, right? Which will manifest itself as a higher climb limited weight. But the problem is obstacle clearance is not just about climb, right? Like the gentleman pointed out, it's also about how much runway does it take to get to V2. And for a less deflected flap, it's going to take more runway. And so as a general rule, for what we would call close-in obstacles, a more deflected takeoff flap that gets us off the runway sooner is probably going to result in a less restrictive obstacle limited weight. On the other hand, for more distant obstacles, taking a penalty in terms of field length, but climbing with a more optimum flap, a less deflected flap, is going to get us a better limiting weight over the distant obstacle. So the bad news is you really can't guess. The good news is we're starting to see a proliferation of real-time dispatch tools that take into account all of this, right? So there are tools available that will tell you what the optimum flap is for a given set of obstacles and give you all the right speeds to fly it. Any other questions? The big thing I want you to remember is this is more than just a simple geometry problem. So don't take the 2.4% or the 3.3%, draw a straight line, and conclude that you're safe with regard to obstacles.
Now that we've established that we as the operator need to come up with our own contingency procedures, let's move on to the next chapter and take a close-up look at ARINC Direct, APG, UltraNav, and the crew's role in safely utilizing these tools.